Greetings, everyone, from beautiful Buffalo Gap, Texas. It's a little town of 463 people south of Abilene, and I'm Tennie McCarty. I'm a therapist, and I own a small treatment center here in Buffalo Gap. Been here 33 years. We treat all addictions with a primary focus on eating disorders and codependency, but we do treat all addictions because what we have figured out is that people may get clean or sober in one addiction, and then they trade off from one addiction to the other until they work on the core pain. So this is not really a professional talk today. 35 years ago today, I flew to Los Angeles to enter myself into treatment for an eating disorder. And I don't tell my personal story very often. I'm willing to tell it. I've told it some, and I'm not ashamed of it at all. But you just don't go around telling your whole story to people unless you're asked. And so the staff at Shades and my good friend that is actually videotaping this, they've encouraged me to tell my story. And the only reason we do, everyone has a story to tell. I don't care what your journey is, we all have a story to tell. And those of us in recovery, it's important, I think, for us to tell our stories. And the reason I'm telling it, if it can touch one person out there, if it can help one person, it's worth my being willing to tell the story. So, about 8 years ago, we had the opportunity at the treatment center to do an 8-part documentary series for the OWN network for Oprah. She just started the OWN network and came to us and asked us if we would be willing to do a documentary series, and it was 8 parts. We worked on it all summer, and it came out, and it was in 8 parts, and it was called Addicted to Food. And I believe it helped a lot of people. I know that it did. And about that time, I had written a book. It had taken me really 2 years to write a book about my life. And I came out with a 552-page memoir. And so I had a book agent, and she lived in New York City. She was a very highly respected book agent. And she shopped the book to the 5 of the top publishing houses in New York City. All 5 of them, you submit 4 or 5 chapters, and then they, if they like it, they'll interview you. And then if they interview you and they like what they see and have read, they make offers. So all 5 of the publishing houses, made us an offer for the book. And we went with Penguin Publishing House, and Amy Einhorn is my book editor. She also had just come out with the book The Help, and so I kind of feel like I'm in good company, being in that. Not that my book is anything, that's a fiction book. Mine is not fiction. It is about the truth. So when it came time to publish the book, Amy called me one day, and she said as they were editing those 552 pages, that they decided it was so dark. She said it was hard for them to even get people to edit it and to read the other chapters, because it's such a dark story. And so she recommended that I start with a prescriptive book, and that's what we did. And this is the book. It's called A Program for How to Stop Dieting and Start Living. So, and then my friend Ashley Judd wrote the foreword, and it was very successful at the time. It became a bestseller. And what Amy said is at some other time we would go ahead and publish the rest of the memoir. But I have not found it necessary to do that, because like she said, it is a dark story. And the reason I can talk about it today is because I've worked through it. I'm no longer my story. It is a story. But I've worked through it. I don't live the story anymore. But I thought with the encouragement of friends and my staff that I would tell my story, since this is the eve of my recovery birthday from an eating disorder. So with that, I'm going to put the book down and I will go into a little bit of the past. I don't want to bore you with all of it, but I do think it's important, for us to tell our stories. And so my story started, I was born in East Texas. I was born to a mother that from the time when I can ever remember, by age 4, my mother had a nervous breakdown. And she started her path of being sick. That also started her on a path of prescription drug abuse. My dad was a very violent man. He was angry, he was rageful, and I spent my entire life being scared of him. He was very abusive. Now, he wasn't physically abusive to us, but he, for some reason, he wanted my mother and I particularly to witness the physical abuse that he caused to others. And I'm not going to go into all of the gory details because they could wind up in a mystery book somewhere. But I will tell you, no child should have ever had to go through what I lived through. I have a sister 3 years older, and I hardly remember her being at home. She found a way of staying out of the home and out of the way a lot. And my sister took after my dad. She was very fair complected. She's blue-eyed, blonde-headed, and thin. And that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. And look at me, I have dark skin, black hair, and from the age 4, I became morbidly obese or started using food and started gaining the weight. So I had set me an impossible goal to reach, to want to look like my sister. And my sister looked like my dad's side of the family, and I looked like my mother's side. And my mother's side of the family had some Indian blood, and so that's where I'm sure I get my black hair. My hair was blue-black. It's been black all my life. Now, I will tell you, it does have a little help today, but anyway, my dad very seldom called me by name. He called me the black baby. And then he was a very prejudiced man, and we lived with his prejudice. He hated anyone that wasn't white, and that covers a lot of nationalities, but we live in Texas. That was really, anyone that had dark skin, particularly African Americans and Hispanics, and it did the opposite with me. Instead of going in his direction, I've always gone the exact opposite. I have been a very much of an advocate for anyone with, that are African American and Hispanic, and I could tell you some stories along those lines, but I'm just going to tell you what it was like growing up in that type of home. So I was 4 years of age. We lived in this oil-filled town in East Texas. My mother got sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker, and so I, by that time, was already very much attached to my mother. I had an attachment disorder that we would call today. I was totally obsessed with my mother. My fear was if she ever got out of my sight, she would die. And a lot of times she'd tell me that, don't leave me, I'll die. And I took her at her word, and so I stayed by her side, and really until I was 30 years of age, as much as I could. So I was 4 years old, went to the doctor with them in Tyler, Texas. We lived in a small town, but we drove over to Tyler to the doctor. I had a memory like an elephant as a young child. I could remember things that I don't know that I don't know, but at age 4, I could still remember. I could remember back as early as age 2. So I was sitting in the doctor's office with my mother and my dad and the doctor, and the doctor told my dad, he said, well, Thad, I don't know what to do with Neva. What she reports is that the pine trees, if you've ever been to East Texas, the pine trees are tall, and they line every highway, every pathway. They're tall trees in East Texas. And what my mother would report, that the trees made her nervous, and that's why she couldn't get well there. And by that time, she was on some very strong medication. It was the old Milltowns that they used to give people, and she stayed on them for years until Valium came along. So the doctor told my dad, he said, Dad, the only thing I know to do is move her to West Texas. And so he did. And if you've been to far West Texas, like Odessa is where we moved. Odessa is where Friday Night Lights movie and then TV show was filmed. And they depicted that town pretty well. They really did a good job of showing that redneck, oil-filled town and how the whole town was obsessed with Permian High School football team. And that's where I went to high school, was Permian High School. So we moved, and so that did not solve her nervous problem. Then it was the wind, it was the sand, and there was one little town close to us that was called No Trees. So there was no trees out there, very little vegetation. But it didn't solve Mother's nervous problem. It continued till the day she died, and she was 87 years old. And I don't know that my mother ever had very many clean days free of prescription drug abuse. Prescription drug abuse, I've come to know through my years of being in the field, a lot of times it's a disease that won't let you live, but it won't let you die. You don't live, you exist. And how my mother existed is she laid on the couch or on the bed. And in order to secure prescription drugs, you have to be sick. And she was. She had every kind of imagined sickness that you can find. Now, I believe today, the body accommodates the mind. I think she had some of those illnesses. I really do. But not all of them. My mother never was well or healthy in any period of time. She might get a short period of time of, being healthy. But my mom and dad had this sick relationship that the only time she got attention from my dad, who was, by the way, a sex addict and a womanizer. And he was gone a lot. And he was, at that time, he had been in the oil field and he got hurt. Then he became a law enforcement officer in that wide open town of Odessa, Texas, that was wild back then. I think it is pretty wild today. And so what Mother did and what her mind told her to do, the only way she got any attention from my dad was being sick. And he'd be off somewhere chasing women or whatever he did. And, she would get sick and she would want me to find him. And of course, that was before cell phones. And a lot of times it was before we had a phone, and I'd have to go to the neighbors and call him. And he would come home and he'd sit on the edge of her bed and she would sit up and he'd say, what's wrong, babe? And he would light her a cigarette and he would smoke a cigarette. And for a few minutes, maybe even an hour, they would be the only two people in the room, the only two people in the house. They would have that love connection over her sickness. And then all of a sudden he would get mad at her and he would start cussing her and raging and calling her every name in the book. And he'd put his gun, he always toted a gun, he'd put a gun to her head, and, tell her that he just needed to blow her head off because she wasn't any good to him. So that's just a little bit of what I grew up with. Like I said, my dad was a womanizer, and my mother liked men. And when she would get feeling a little better, she didn't chase men like my dad chased women, but she would take me with her everywhere she went, everywhere. And it was during the time in Odessa, like I said, it was a wide open oil field town, and it was built very fast. It was in the late 40s. And they had built up these little buildings and made dance halls and beer joints out of them. Texas Monthly had an article about those beer joints about 6 or 7 months ago. And it brought back lots of memories because those beer joints were called the Nip and Sip. They were called Dance Land and the Melody Club. And I remember all of them because as a little child, when my dad would be off somewhere doing whatever he did, my mother would take me to those beer joints. And, I would be 5, 6, 7 years of age, should have been in school, but I would be with her. And they'd have these little wooden dance floors, and I would get up and dance with the men, and they would give me 50-cent pieces. And as a child, I thought that was fine. I didn't know we were doing something that we didn't need to be doing. So when I was about 5, my eating disorder really had not started yet. It was between age 4 and 5. Right after we moved to Odessa. So actually we lived at Andrews that time, right north of Odessa. But nevertheless, my mother had an affair going with the man that we lived, couldn't find a place to live because of the oil boom. So we lived in a little apartment, and next door there was a trailer house. And there was a man that lived there. His name was Mr. Young, and he had a wife that was a very obese, very overweight. And my mother was a good-looking woman, and they struck up a conversation, and then they started having an affair. My sister would be in school, and we would spend all day with Mr. Young. My dad would be gone, and then my mother would say, "Now, baby, this is our little secret. Now, don't you tell Daddy." And so I didn't tell him. And so one time my grandmother was sick in Oklahoma, and my dad went up there and took my sister with him. And that gave Mother and Mr. Young a whole weekend together. And of course, I went. And we went to Odessa, which was 30 miles away, and went to the beer joints, and we danced, and they drank, and we danced, and they drank, and then we went to what they called back then tourist courts, called the Blue Top Inn. And we got a room, and I slept on the pallet, and they slept in the bed. On the way home, Mom said, "Do not tell your daddy what we have been doing. What we did this weekend. Just tell him that you were with your aunt and uncle, that we were, visited your aunt and uncle." And so I was taught early on, and this is what happens to children who are raised in dysfunctional homes, particularly alcoholic, drug addict homes. They're taught early on to not trust anybody outside the home, which I was taught that early. Don't have any feelings because feelings don't matter. And another thing is don't tell anyone what's going on. And Mother reinforced that, do not tell your dad. So I didn't. And it was a couple of weeks later, my dad was methodical. He would wait and he would think things out. And my dad was a violent man. He could tell stories that, how he had harmed people, cut people up, would shoot, on and on and on. It was like his badge of honor to tell those stories. So here it was on a Saturday morning, about a couple of weeks after our journey for the weekend with Mr. Young, and they got us up early that morning, got my sister and I up early and sent us outside to play. And I went and hid behind the community bathhouse so I could look and see our little apartment. And I had a knot in the pit of my stomach. Even as that young of age, I was very intuitive, and I had a knowing something was coming down. And I watched, and all of a sudden my mother went over to Mr. Young's trailer and brought him over to the apartment. And my biggest fear was, let me back up. What had happened before then, about a week before then? My dad never took me anywhere. And I think it was because I looked too much like my mother, but he always took my sister places. But he asked me one morning, because I wasn't in school, he asked me if I wanted to go riding with him. And so he started to Odessa, and there's a liquor store between those two little towns. And he stopped at the liquor store and he bought himself a half pint of Old Charter, and he bought me a sack of candy. And on the way to Odessa then, he asked me, he said, well, baby, what did you, black baby, what did you and mama do while your old daddy was gone? And I started eating that candy, and I started spilling the beans. I started telling the secrets. And I told him, and I told him, and I took him, we went to 8th Street. I showed him the honky tonks that we went to. I pointed out the Blue Top Inn. He got the key from the front desk person. It happened to be the same young man that was there, same man. I didn't know that it was a young man, he was just a man. I pointed out the room, he unlocked the door, we went in, and he had me to show where I slept and where Mr. Young slept. I told him everything that I could remember. So having that information, and then the following week or two, standing behind that bathhouse, watching Mother go invite the man into their little apartment, in my mind's eye as a kid, in my imagination, I made up that they were going to get in there and really talk about me. You know, children are self-centered. I thought they were going to talk about me and how I had told the secrets. I thought it was more that they were going to find out that I told the secrets. Well, they did. They talked about what had happened while he was gone. And in a few minutes, Mr. Young started stumbling out the door, and my dad had cut his throat from one ear to the other. An ambulance came and got him, took him to the hospital. Of course, my mother went all to pieces. An ambulance came and got her. Sheriff's Department or police, somebody came and got my dad. And then it was toward almost dark, and I stood behind that bathhouse, and I messed all over myself. I wet on myself. I was paralyzed in fear. And I noticed that my aunt drove up. She got my sister, and she started looking for me. And I would hide, and I would hide, and I would hide. I did not want to leave that trailer park, afraid my mother would come back and I wouldn't be there. And I kept hiding from her, hiding from her. Finally, my aunt left. Later on in the night, it was dark. I don't know what time it was, but it was dark. The landlady came and found me and took me to her house. I remember her putting a t-shirt on me. I guess it was her husband or something, I don't know. And I guess to distract me, I still haven't figured it out, the woman pierced my ears. Go figure. But anyway, what happened is the man lived. He stayed under police guard in the hospital for 6 months, and because he would not file charges on my dad, the state didn't, and he got off scot-free. But my dad always said that he would eventually kill him, and he did. And I'm not going to go into all of that. That's just one story, one story. I wanted to tell you that was the event that started my eating disorder. Now, a lot of people have eating disorders that don't have anything like that is so drastic. But what happened to me, I started using food like my mother used prescription drugs and alcohol. I know today I have the same type of addictive behavior, the addictive personality, the addictive brain chemistry, that when I put that sugar, that candy in my mouth, it changed the way I felt. And I couldn't get enough of it. And by the time I was in the 1st grade, I mean, I had started gaining weight and gaining weight and gaining weight. And, you know, a couple of years later, when I would start in the 1st grade, and they weighed all of us in front of everyone, I weighed 39 pounds, 139 pounds as a little 1st grader. And that's 10 pounds more than I weigh now. So it kept, the food addiction was embedded in me. And I used food and used food in used food and got bigger and bigger till I ate myself up to 287 pounds. I was my mother's caretaker, my mother's caregiver. Like I said, I was totally obsessed with my mother. My mother, and I don't talk about this a lot. I talked about it the other day, but I never have talked about it a lot. I lived my childhood in Medical Center Hospital in Odessa, Texas. I would ride the ambulance with my mother. She would get to needing stronger meds, mainly Demerol. And on an average of at least every 2 weeks, I would have to call an ambulance because she would go into what we called her spells. She would go all to pieces and she couldn't stop crying. She would get hysterical and she needed to go to the emergency room. She needed to go to the hospital. And I would call the ambulance, and I got to where I had the number memorized. By that time, we did have a phone. It was a wall phone. And I would ride the ambulance with her. And as that progressed through the years, up until it really started pretty severely when I was about 9 or 10, I would keep her a bag packed, and I would keep myself a few clothes in there. And what they would do, looking back, I don't know if they didn't have child protective services back then. I don't know. But what that people in that hospital did, they took care of me. My dad wouldn't be around. He would always be out somewhere where he couldn't be contacted. And they would put me in bed. The hospital would put me in bed in Mother's room. And usually she would have, someone in the room with her, but I would sleep in there. And at that time, the elementary school where I went to was downtown. They hadn't built the new one. And so I could walk to school from the hospital, about 8 blocks. How many kids do that? I've never known anyone in my life that lived in a hospital with their mother and walked to school. And we'd be there about a week maybe. And by that time the food addiction was getting worse and worse. And she would go on spells. My mother was at times an overeater, and then she would jokingly say, well, I just fell off to 180. She'd be up over 200 pounds, but she never got as heavy as I did. And she would joke, she's a big joker, and she'd say, well, I just fell off to 180 pounds. And then she would quit eating, and I know today it was because of the drugs. She would quit eating and get down as low as 90 pounds. And today we'd say that's anorexia. So I'd be in her room and her tray of food would come and they'd bring me a tray. I'd eat mine, she wouldn't eat hers, I would eat hers, and half the time I would finish her roommate, whoever her roommate was. So I would have 2 or 2.5 meals in her room, and then I would go exploring, and my favorite place was to go to the snack bar. The woman that worked there took a liking to me. I don't know, I think everybody in that hospital felt sorry for me, I don't know, but everyone knew me by name, kind of like that old Cheers TV show. Everyone called me by my name. And I would go in there and she would fix me a cheeseburger. So I would have had 2.5 meals plus a cheeseburger. And I kept gaining weight and gaining weight. By the time I was 13 years old, I weighed about 220. And, Mother would kind of halfway put me on a diet, but I did most of the cooking, all of the cooking, and I'll do the grocery shopping. And, Mother was an orphan. When I look back, see, I don't really fault my parents. I've had in my recovery and in my journey as a therapist, I've had to go back and look how they grew up. My dad was the oldest of 13 children. At 13, he was the oldest of 10 children. His father died, and he had to raise those younger kids. I don't know if that is what put him in so much rage. I don't know. But he, grew up without a dad. They grew up poor. It was, they lived through the Dust Bowl of West Texas, and then they moved to Oklahoma. Times were hard. My mother was an orphan. Well, her mother died when she was 10, and they had 10 children, and my mother was the oldest of the three youngest one, and she raised her little brother and sister. Her dad was, I would call him mentally ill. I know mother was mentally ill, that her dad, after he lost his wife, could not stay out there on that old farm. And so my mother and those little kids lived basically on that farm by themselves. They went to school very little. So when I look back at their history, I can't fault them a whole lot. And it took me a long time to get angry at either one of them. But through therapy, I finally found the anger. And it looked more like rage, because I grew up with a lot of rage. We have what we call carried feelings of our parents. And I looked over at my dad and I picked up his rage, and I became a rager in my adult life. And I looked at my mother, and my mother was full of self-pity. And she cried all the time. She felt sorry for herself. She taught me to feel sorry for myself. So that's a bad combination, to be on one hand a rager, and on the other hand crying and feeling sorry for yourself. And that's how I grew up and entered my adult life. So at age 13, I had heard about a diet doctor that gave out pills and all. And like I said, I weighed about 230, and I talked mother into us going over there to see this diet doctor. And of course, by that time I was driving, and I drove us over there, and the doctor scribbled something. He took an assessment and scribbled something across the top. And he went out to get the medication, and I turned that form around, and what it said was morbid obesity. I did not know what morbid obesity was. I thought I had a real bad disease. And guess what? I did. But at 13, I just thought I was a slob. I thought I was fat. Nobody liked me. Boys particularly don't like fat girls. Girls don't like to hang out with fat girls. So I didn't know what morbid obesity was. I do today. I would lose a little weight, and then, of course, I would gain it back, and plus some. And the violence continued. My mother's sickness continued, and I was my mother's total caretaker. So when I was about 18, I won't go into all of it, but I will say I had a short marriage. I had a baby. I was overweight when I was in the hospital. And by the way, my mother would on a regular basis, would try to kill herself. So actually, we'd call the ambulance for her, because she was had overdosed. It was a deliberate overdose. She was trying to kill herself. So I called an ambulance and rode with her to the hospital, and I went into labor. So I was in one wing of the hospital having a baby, and she was in the other wing, her stomach being pumped out. That pretty much describes my childhood and my teenage years. Never had a date, and I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me. Do not feel sorry for me, because my life's not like that today. Everything I'm about today is a direct result of coming out of the type of life I had. One thing I forgot to mention, at about 8 years of age, I started taking myself to a little church, a little country church behind our house there in Odessa. And I don't know if those little people knew anything about what was going on in my house, but they took care of me. And for 1 year, I went to that little church, and they just loved me. They just loved me. And I never missed a service, and I won a white Bible for perfect attendance. Not only did I find unconditional positive love and regard there, I found God. And I absolutely found him and knew that God was the answer. Now, did I always count on him? No, but I've started a process of seeking God in every area of my life. As a child, with what whatever knowledge I could gain, I started seeking God. So that has been my salvation. So like I said, no one needs to feel sorry for me. And I would never want to go back to my childhood and would never want anyone else to have to live there. But I'm okay today because I have been willing to do the work. And one of the things is I wrote in my child's baby book that I'm going to go home and go on a diet and lose weight. You know, doesn't that sound like a teenager? And I'm going to find you a daddy. And that's exactly what I did. I went home. My dad had never really shown love to anyone. But when that baby was born, he fell deeply in love with my child. And he loved that child, the only person I think I've ever known him to really love without wanting anything from him. Was my first child, and he loved and adored that baby, and he started taking care of him. He started staying home more, and he wouldn't hardly let me pick him up. Anyway, for many reasons, I had to go to work. Probably about a month after the baby was born, I went to work at a grocery store, and the only thing I ate was, I do not recommend this as a food plan, but I would drink a RC Cola and eat 2 chocolate cupcakes every day. And the weight began to fall off of me, and I lost a lot of weight in a short period of time. And I was young, and I think I probably looked attractive. The men that worked there in that grocery store were all married, and I didn't know what it was like for people to flirt with you. I'd never been flirted with in my life, and they'd flirt with me, and it was confusing. Or they'd be extra nice to me and want to invite me out to dinner, and I would say, well, is your wife going? I couldn't get it. I couldn't get that I was attractive. So, but I wanted out of that house. I knew I had to get out of the house because my dad was getting too attached to the baby, and he said, you're never going to have this baby unless you find you a good man to take care of you. And he thought the odds of that was going to be pretty low, of me finding a good man to take care of me. So that was really my goal. Working in that grocery store, I got to thinking, how can I find a good man to marry me, to get me out of that house? So there was a man that would come through my checkout stand, and we'd shoot the breeze together, and he was on his second divorce, and he had 3 kids, and he'd tell me his problems, and I would listen, and he liked to drink beer. And anyway, he started coming out to our house, and him and Mom were good friends, and they'd sit and shoot the breeze. By this time, Dad was already out doing whatever he always did, chasing women or something, and so he would come out, and they would tell dirty jokes and drink beer, and while I was cleaning up the house and taking care of the baby. So one evening, they invited my mother and I to go to this drive-in, and the drive-in also sold beer. And so I was sitting in the middle with the baby, and then my mother was on the right and he was on the left, and he leaned over at my mother and he said, Neva, it looks like that we're going to be getting married. And my first thought was, well, what are they going to do with Daddy? I thought it was the 2 of them, because they really had a lot more of a relationship than we did, and a lot more in common. But he meant it with me and him. Now, this was an old man. He was 32 years old. I wasn't quite 19, But, I've always had this keen mind, and I got to thinking afterwards, maybe this is my way out of that house. So I met the man, he was working in an oil company, and I met the man that was the comptroller for that oil company. He also came through my check stand. And we went for coffee one day, and by the time we got through with that coffee, I had found out what the man that was apparently asking me to marry him, I found out how much money he made. He made $425 a month plus 1% of the gross of the company. And I figured out through this man how much that company, the oil boom was on, how much that company grossed. And I looked at that amount and I thought, hot dog, that'll get me out of that house. I mean, that is my escape. That's my way out of the house. And I started planning a wedding. His divorce wasn't even final, but I started planning a wedding. Through the years, jokingly, we've said years later that he was looking for sex and I was looking for security, and we put it together and called it love. We had no idea. I had no idea that he was an alcoholic, because I thought an alcoholic, drank some, but mainly took prescription drugs, and they wore out couches laying around. I didn't know an alcoholic could get up every day and go to work. I had no idea. And so, I thought, this will be good. He makes good money. His two daughters were going to live in Arizona with his mother forever and always, and his little boy is going to come live with us. And along with our baby. And I thought, well, good, we'll have us a ready-made family, and I'll have my own little house that I can decorate. And I lived in a fantasy, folks. A fantasy. Because the minute we got married, I started cooking and I started eating. I started cooking and I started eating. And then one night, my husband was very punctual coming home for dinner. And one night he didn't show up. And we waited and waited. And my bonus son, stepson, I called him my bonus son, said, well, I know where Daddy is. I was young, and one time, sometimes I'd be like his mother. The next time we'd be like two kids arguing. And he said, well, I know where Dad is. I said, no, you don't. And he said, yes, I do. And I said, no, you don't. He said, well, drive down there and I'll show you. I said, well, where is he? He said, the Drillers Club. I said, what's the Drillers Club? He said, well, it's a pool hall, and they get in there and drink and play pool, and they play poker, they gamble. And women can't go in there. And I said, really? Women can't go in there? So I got the baby in that was before car seats. I put the baby in the car and my bonus son, and here we went downtown to the Drillers Club. I pulled up there and parked, had my baby in my arms, and my stepson kept saying, you can't go in there, women can't go in there. And I just pushed my way in there, and I looked around all those pool tables, and there he was. I found him. And remember, I had picked up my dad's rage, and it would come out whenever it needed to. But I found him, and I took the baby and plopped him down on the middle of that pool table. When you live in dysfunction, you get as insane as the people around you. But I plopped my wonderful baby on the pool table, and I picked up the pool stick, jerked it out of his hands. I started beating my husband with the pool stick, and then I would throw those cue balls at him. And then all of a sudden, I caught myself, and I got into a shame attack. And I looked around, and those guys were laughing and making fun of RL, and so I ran out of the pool hall and got in the car. And then I realized I had left my baby sitting on that pool table. That's the sickness that we get into when we live around addiction. So anyway, those are some stories about how we started our happy marriage. And then he had an opportunity, long story short, he had an opportunity to go into business for himself. And used to, when we would go and tell our stories in 12-step groups or whatever, my husband would always say, you can tell anything you want to about me, but don't forget to sober me up. And my husband, my beloved Mr. Mack, I called him, we were married 51 years. He was married the first time 7 years, the second time 7 years, and I always like to tell that I got nervous on the 7th year. But I didn't. I was a stayer. And so we were married 51 years. And I started to a support group in 1968, October of 1968, for families of alcoholics. And 14 years later, my husband found help. And so when he passed away 7 years ago, he had 32 years of sobriety. 32 years of sobriety. And he became a changed man. And along the way, I looked around before he got sober. I looked around one day. You know, we had 3 daughters. We had the 2 sons and his 2 daughters. We raised off and on 7 children. And, you know, my husband always made us a good living. But I looked around one day and I thought, he might die of alcoholism and I might have to make a living for these children. So what I did is I started to school and I became a chemical dependency counselor here in our county, one of the first women. And keep in mind, my eating disorder, which we didn't know back then to call it an eating disorder. I ate myself up to 287 pounds, but I would find a way to lose 120 or 140 and I'd gain it back within the same year. I did that 5 different times, and the last time I thought, this time it's got to be different. It's got to be different. But what I couldn't do is I could not stop the eating. I could not. I ate massive amounts of food. And in 1972, I had what they call the old-timey type of intestinal bypass surgery. It was very dangerous. They don't even do it today. It was so dangerous. What they did, in essence, was made me just a straight gut. Everything that I would eat would go out in diarrhea, and I couldn't absorb anything. I got very ill, but I never would tell anyone. I mean, I became a workaholic. I kept a spotless house. I worked out in the community. I felt like I was always good. I mean, bad, needing to get good. I never knew I was sick, needing to get well. And I thought that about my husband. I thought we were just bad people, need to get good, and not sick, need to get well. So I got us to a church, and we went to church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and you know, by this time the rage was getting worse, and I abused my children, particularly one. I had one child that was an acting out child. And today we call, you know, we know that is the one's called the IP, the identified patient. And she's the middle child, and she's the one that actually got us help, because you'll get help for a child when you won't get help for yourself. So my daughter, the first words that she ever spoke, she stuttered at age 2. And I started finding help for my daughter. Her name is Kim. And I took her to every counselor, every therapist, every play therapist, anywhere I knew to take her, to the rehab for stuttering. And everyone would tell me, all the counselors would tell me, why don't you take her back to nursery school or to grade school or to junior high or whatever, and you come back. And I finally heard them, and I did, and I started getting help, and I started getting better. And my husband didn't want any part of it, but I started getting better and better and healthier, and started addressing the rage. So anyway, I want to make this as short as I can. I went back to school, and I realized that he might not be able to make us a living, and there was no alcoholism treatment centers in this area. There used to be, and it turned into an old flop house. They just detox people there. And I went to work there mainly to get hours. At that time, I didn't need the money. My husband was making good money, but I went because I knew I needed to prepare myself for maybe making a living later. So I went to work in this flop house, and I was going to school or had finished my education, and I knew that could be turned into a healthy drug and alcohol treatment center. So along with other people, it's not just me, I got a lot of people on board, And we implemented a program there, and it became a very healthy, very positive treatment center, and I loved it. I loved the work. And my husband, had quite a bit of money, and he would donate enough money during the month to, like pay my salary. But I knew it wouldn't continue. I was afraid it wouldn't continue like that. So after having that surgery, I could never stop the eating. And so I lost a lot of weight with the surgery, a lot of weight. But I couldn't stop the eating. And the body wants to restore itself. So I started gaining the weight back, and that was my biggest fear. And I got up to about 190, 195. And people wouldn't even look me in the eye that had known me when I was 60, 65 pounds lighter, because they knew I would brag about having had that surgery. And so I got up in my pea brain, and by the way, the diarrhea stopped. That's when I started gaining the weight. The diarrhea, my body restored itself, and it stopped virtually. And so I got up in my little pea brain, and I thought, well, if it was the diarrhea making me lose the weight, what I need to do is take laxatives. So in 1973, actually, after having the surgery in 72, I started taking laxatives. And like any medication, it stops working. So I would take 2 and 4 and 6 and 8, and by September of 1985, I was up to taking 100 to 125 X-Lax a day because they stopped working. And I was seeing an internist because I was getting very ill. Through tests, he said my liver was shutting down. They thought I was an alcoholic. My liver was shutting down. My colon was falling out of my body. And I never once told him, Doctor, I am taking 100 X-Lax plus a day, because I didn't want to stop taking them. I had so much fear of gaining that weight back. And so, but I remember finding God when I was 8. All my life I prayed for answers about, wanting to be thin was what I wanted. I wanted to be thin. God help me to quit eating so I'll be thin. God help me, God help me, God help me. And he did. I was getting very, very ill, and I had liver spots all over my face. My hair was falling out. I was a mess, and really no one knew, no one noticed, and I didn't tell one person what I was doing with the laxatives. And I had hired a young man to be a therapist there in the treatment center, and he came from LA. Everything kind of starts on the East and West Coast and moves to the center. And this young man was very good therapist. And one day I walked into work, and he asked if he could talk to me in the library. And I went in there and sat down, and he said, he was kind of hip, slick, and cool, and he said, Tennie, I think you're a bull. And I thought he thought I was gay. And I said, well, Alan, I think you're an idiot. What are you talking about? And he said, I think you're a bulimic. Well, I'd never heard the word. I didn't know what he was talking about. And he started describing my symptoms, the liver spots on my face, picked up my hair was falling out. My skin was dry and scaly. And he said that I'd get upset, maybe in group, and the guys, I'd call for a break, the guys would go out and smoke, and he said he'd watch me. I'd go to the candy machine, get 2 candy bars, lock myself up in the bathroom, and when I came out, I'd be, calm down. And he said, I think you have an eating disorder. And how he knew to recognize my symptoms was his wife was recovering bulimic and anorexic. And she had been in recovery for over a year, and she had lived with a friend of theirs in LA. That's where she got her recovery. Her friend had also suffered from bulimia, and she was a psychologist there in LA County, and she was getting ready to go to work for an eating disorder unit. And I always say it's abusive to point out a problem without pointing out a solution. And Alan pointed out the problem, but he also pointed out a solution. And he handed me a book called Fat is a Family Affair by Dr. Judy Hollis. It had just come out. I went home and read it, and I read myself on every page. Judy's story was much like mine, and I read myself on every page. Alan kept calling me. He wanted me to call out to the treatment center. It was opening on Tuesday. And finally, I did the research, and I had never bought a plane ticket. I bought a plane ticket. So what happened is September the 19th of 1985, I entered the doors of treatment at Edgemont Hospital. They don't even have the treatment center there anymore. It lasted for 1 year, but it saved my life. And I'm very grateful today that they treated me like I was treating the drug addicts, alcoholics every day at the Serenity House. They treated it as an addiction and treated it through using the 12 steps plus a lot of other modalities like body image work, different things. And while I was out there, I uncovered and discovered a lot of sexual abuse. I'd always known it, but I just put it in the back of my mind, and I really didn't work on it while I was in treatment. But I got absent. The food got in order. And it took over a week. I mean, I had so much pain of giving up the laxatives, emotional pain and physical pain. But I stayed the course. And that 30-day treatment program changed my life and my family's life. Everything I'm about today has directly come from me seeking treatment and then following directions. And I'll tell you, I've treated a lot of different types of people with different types of addictions. And I've seen people come in and take hold of the recommendations, and they get in wonderful recovery and never use again. And I've seen some that will kind of halfway, half measure, they say, avails it's nothing. I've seen some people be able to kind of stay alive but not really giving it its all. And then I've also seen this disease of addiction kill many wonderful people through the years. But I was one of those that was looking for help, and I got it, and I took every direction that they told me to take, and I started getting better. And it was not easy. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I started getting better. And I stayed on the food plan that I got in treatment, and I did not vary from it one iota for the first 18 years. And then gradually I'd kind of, substitute some things or add, but I was so afraid that I would get back to the compulsive eating and the bulimia. So after I came home from treatment, we kept getting calls at the treatment center. The energy goes out. People found out I'd gone to treatment. I was losing the weight again, and it got out, and people would call to see if we treated eating disorder clients. So actually, I went to the board of directors and contracted for 8 beds and started treating eating disorder clients there in the drug alcohol center. And the only reason they let me do it is it was a state-supported facility, and actually they needed the money. But nevertheless, I kept it there a year. Then I moved out to Buffalo Gap, where we are now, and we've been here for 33 years. I have made working, through God's help. It's not just all about me. I want you to hear it's not I. By myself, I am zero. But by the grace of God, I made a decision on the way home from treatment in the plane that I was going to come home and make working with people with all addictions, with the primary focus of eating disorders. By that time, I learned about codependency, and I've been a codependent since I was a little girl, codependent on my mother, taking care of her, and then it transferred to my husband. And so my commitment to God was to come home and make my life's work working with all addictions with the primary focus on eating disorders and codependency. And, I came home, I had to get lots of other training. I would go anywhere in the United States for a week, a 2-week program, whatever, to learn to do the things that we do here at Shades of Hope. Because the kind of work that we do here saved my life. After I quit the eating and quit using the food to push the pain down, the pain came up so big, it was choking me to death. And so I was recommended to go to a trauma program down in Florida. I did that for 30 days to work on the trauma of the abuse in childhood. And then I would go and do weekends or 8 days or 5 days. I kept working on the abuse until one day I woke up and I thought, I'm done. I'm free of it. That's why I can talk to you about it today like news, weather, and sports. I'm not crying. I'm not hysterical. Used to, I could hardly say my name. I was very bashful, very withdrawn. I couldn't even utter a sound hardly to anyone. But through a lot of help along the way, a lot of good professionals, a lot of support through good friends, through my family, I'm free today. I'm free of the eating disorder. I'm free. And I didn't have just eating disorders, and I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but I became a severe work addict after my eating disorder got in place. Then I wanted to work 80 or 90 hours a week. And then I became a compulsive spender and had to, work on that for a year because people with eating disorders especially are like grabber persons. We grab anything out here to bring it inside to make us feel better. So I have multi-addictions that I have treated, and by the grace of God, I hope I don't have any more. I don't plan to pick up anything. I live free today. I live honest today. I'm 77 years old, and one of my greatest joys is walking a half a block from here where the center is and going and working with clients, because this is a different treatment center. We set it up. It's my mission. It's a passion. My family has joined me in it. Good friends have joined me in it, in the support. And I love working with others. I get a front row seat at miracle watching. And it's not me. It is not me. It's God working through me and every staff person over there. We get to see miracles every day. So thank you for listening to my story. If it helps even one person, it has been worth it. And knowing if you're suffering from any addiction, there is help available. You do not have to stay where you are, whether it's an eating disorder, sex addiction, love addiction, alcoholism, drug addiction, you name it. There's help and hope for recovery. So I hope it's not a story to enjoy, but I hope it's been helpful. And thank you for listening.